Boys movement. So, well, good. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. We're kind of trickling in. I guess on Mother's Day, people are out to eat or something. So it goes. You recall when we ended last time, and we've been looking at this transition that's taken place in the early quarter of the century. Of this change from the apostolic way of looking at things, this world is not my home, and the views on civil government that Lipscomb and others had firmly established in a large segment of our fellowship, and so we've been looking and seeing how this happened to where we are today. That understanding is just kind of way in the distant past and doesn't make sense. But at one time it did, and it was very challenging. And so when we ended last time, we were talking about George Benson, who was the president at Harding, and we were looking at that just as an example of this change and transition that took place. And when he came in, he took over for J.N. Armstrong. And part of it, he was under a lot of heat because he was of that very apostolic, pacifist way of looking at things that he'd been trained in by Harding and others. And so Benson had been one of his pupils. And so they thought, well, we'll bring him in. And he'd been a missionary in China. And he'd seen what was happening with the communism and all the problems with that and so on and so forth. And so that greatly influenced his thinking. And so when he then came over here, those understandings and way of looking at things influenced how he looked at things. And we also said part of that transition was also by Clinton Davis. And Clinton Davis is one that had also trained under Harding. And some others, and he made it really big financially up in New York and things, and so that understanding influenced things, and he helped Benson and taught him a lot of stuff. I remember Harding was in university was in tremendous college, I guess I should say, was in tremendous debt, and Benson helped get him out of it, and part of that was Harding was looked at as a place that was supporting this apocalyptic premillennial outlook, and so by some quarters of the fellowship, that was not good, and so they were kind of hammering on him. Well, some of the funding sources, if you will, dried up, and so they had to look to other means, and Clinton Davis put them in contact with differing titans, if you will, of industry and American business and so on, and they kind of helped to support Harding because they were promoting these things that Benson was, also for, and so we see this blending of the American theme and the Christian theme and so on together as almost in some quarters became viewed as simultaneous, meaning they're one and the same, and so that's kind of where we left off. And in this regard, Benson and Davidson represent an ironic trend among churches of Christ, that those who helped lead churches of Christ in the 30s and 40s toward full participation in political and cultural affairs were almost always people whose roots ran deeply in the soil of the Stone Lipscomb tradition as it had been shaped. How could this be? After all, apocalyptic pessimism regarding human progress had stood at the heart of the tradition since the days of Stone. And so what is this acculturation that is going on? How did that happen? Well, the answer lies in the fact that when the explicit apocalyptic dimensions of our Stone Lipscomb tradition began to erode in the period after World War I, those with roots in this tradition typically went one of two ways. Many who opposed the premillennial position of R.H. Bull simply exchanged the sectarian posture, if you will, of Stone for the one of Campbell. Now, when we say radicalized position, we're saying Campbell had his position and his others took it and ran with it and went further than maybe Campbell was ever doing it, but that was their influence. And where they had once arrayed themselves against the world and its values, they now arrayed themselves with the surrounding denominations. In other words, we're going to be like everybody else, and the culture. We have already seen this pattern in the Gospel Advocates' opposition to R.H. Bull, when, remember, they were taking him on, and others took a different path, refusing to fight premillennialism, but at the same time finding the apocalyptic perspective increasingly irrelevant in a world in which they live. They shifted their focus to another aspect of the Stone Campbell tradition, the emphasis on faith in a sovereign God. Severed from its apocalyptic underpinnings, this faith quickly became faith in self, nation, economy, and in God to sustain the American system. So what is the author talking about here? Okay? He's saying that when those apocalyptic underpinnings, the reasons why they held those positions were removed, that in his view, he's saying all there is that you have faith. Now, what does he mean by that? Or what is that faith in? Well, a little bit we were touching on that. Remember, we see this equating going on, and we can all equate things to where we're saying this is the same as that. And so we see this blending of culture and the American way and so on and so forth as being almost simultaneous with the way Christianity should be. Okay? And not all saying that's right or wrong or something. We see this shift going on away from, have nothing to do with that, stay away from that, don't vote, don't go in the military, so on and so forth. Okay? And so it's a change. Now, for us on this side of it, we go, what's kind of the big deal? Because we kind of understand that. We grew up probably thinking and agreeing with this. I know I did, and I didn't grow up in the Church of Christ, but that was kind of what was in Protestantism, if you will, 50, 60 years ago, was what was kind of that thing. And so we see this shift that's going on. In suppressing your emphasis on the coming kingdom of God, remember, God's kingdom's coming. He's going to destroy all this. Quit putting your time into it and focus on God. These people suppress their sense of divine judgment on human progress and potential. Ironically, in this fashion, they often replace pessimism regarding this world with faith or in the power of positive thinking. Now, who was the big positive thinking guy in the 40s and 50s? You're right. Anybody remember who that was? Bill.
Bill Moody, positive mental attitude. Or positive.
Well, this idea of this positive thinking, and I remember, I'm born in '61, grew up in the '60s, and '70s, and so I remember my dad even had some of his books, even though they might have been 20 years old, or written 20 years prior to that, sitting in there, and you're saying, why don't I say the guy's name? Because I knew it this morning and I already forgot it. So we can all relate, right? It'll come to me in the middle of something. But, and so, I did, but Bill.
I've got another candidate.
Okay.
Football coach, Gerald Carter.
No.
If you weren't a positive mental attitude, played for him,
Well, they just needed proper motivation. Thank you, Norman Vincent Peale. That's exactly who it was. And he was up in, I think, New York. And so he had tremendous influence. And so he was promoting that equating and frankly, we see kind of I don't know if the beginnings is the right word because I haven't looked far enough back, but we see some similarities between what Clinton Davis and others were promoting as what we would call today the health and wealth gospel. That that understanding, that way of looking at some things, certainly had, I don't know if it's proper to say roots, but certainly was in some of that thinking. Clinton Davis, as we said, typified this trend. Ironically, in '61, he attributed his financial success, and he was very successful, to biblical principles he says he learned from James Harding when he attended Potter College. A large part of my business success I attribute to the influence of those daily chapel talks at Potter College by James A. Harding. He drove home again and again the fundamental facts in God, the need of serving Him and our fellow man, and the possibility of doing big things by His help. And so Davis is saying he was very influenced by this. Now, frankly, Harding would say, "What are you doing?" Because he would not, however, he's taking this and kind of, that's how it's developing in the way he's looking at things. Not saying that's right or wrong, just saying that, that's how he took that. Over the years, however, Davidson radically transformed Harding's meaning. Harding viewed the Bible as an apocalyptic manual for countercultural living, and Davidson viewed the Bible as a manual for financial success. Anyone in this world with normal intelligence and industry enough to apply himself to the task should succeed by simply following the principles laid down in the Bible. And you know what? We've probably heard that. We've heard that before. We understand that, and we don't necessarily disagree with that. Okay? And probably very much agree with it, if you will. And so among the principles David prized most was the biblical affirmation that all things work together for the good of them that love God. And of course, that scripture is hanging on many people's walls, on a little plaque or something they may have put up. Harding took this passage to mean that God sometimes sends us hardships to make us better people. He by no means precluded the tragic dimensions of life. If God cares for a man, He gives them all the hunger, thirst, toil, discouragement, persecution, affliction, cold, nakedness, and sickness that are good for them. And He also gives them all the gladness, joy, peace, comfort, food, raiment, shelter, friends, houses, horses, buggies, and everything else that He needs for His happiness and usefulness. And so, talking about a worldview, into every life rain must fall. We've heard all the terminology. In other words, try and understand these things of how do who is it that wrote the book Bad Things Happen to Good People? Anybody remember that book? I can't remember who wrote that. But anyhow, in other words, that kind of thinking. In other words, how do we understand these difficulties in life that we go through? And Harding's view is, of course, hey, that's just enough to make us appreciate God and so on and so forth. And that's certainly not an unscriptural view of things. Well, Davidson, on the other hand, interpreted the passage to mean even misfortunes ultimately would contribute to the financial success of those who love God. Harding would have read Mark 10:43 through 44, which says, "Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be a slave to all." As counseling radical servanthood, Davis read it as a key to amassing riches. He thought it unfortunate that many people still believe that the reward from service comes only in the afterlife. He viewed the Bible as a sort of case book of success stories. David, Joseph, Daniel, Moses, Jesus, and Paul. Davis viewed them as remarkable salespersons who knew how to persuade people to think and behave as they wished. Now, we might look at that view and say, hey, wait a minute here, what's going on? But you know what? A lot of times as we read the Bible and look at it, what do we often do? We try to relate to those who we're reading about, and we often try to think of, we put our circumstances on them and wonder how they would handle it. And I'm not saying that's weird or strange. I just think that's how we do things. And so Davis with his tremendous success in what he's doing, is viewing through that lens these scriptural passages. Yes. He's talking about that they were masters of being able to get people to do what they wanted. Is the way he's viewing it. Now, not trying to say right or wrong, just saying this is how he kind of viewed things. And you know what? If you think about it, if we were so massively successful, how do we not think? We think all blessings come from God, and if I've been given this pile of money and financial success, well, God's really blessing me. And so, that's how we think and look at things. And so, sure. I understand why that makes you uncomfortable, and I don't disagree with it, or with what you're saying, but nonetheless, and so.
There again, that's the case of you have to be careful how you approach that. Remember, his plan was for them to go
Sure. Well, that's what Clinton Davis is saying. Okay, well, this is just his view. Bill.
Yes, I would just want to put Joe is that he would, our comment about Joe's comment is that he was the most successful example you ever want to experience on earth. He did die on the cross,
Yeah,
but that was his purpose and his intention.
sure.
That was the plan.
Yeah. And I think as we look at some of these quotes, it's also important that, they may be meaning something more specific and not applying to every, single aspect. But anyhow.
All through the Old Testament, though, that was kind of an interruption.
What do you mean?
I stopped you when you started to say
Oh, that's all right.
And the whole process of the Old Testament and even in the New Testament rewards for actions or your direction, choice of pathways in life are example after example after example. Those that tried to hide and steal some portion of their riches on property they sold,
Yeah.
at death then, they were punished then, used it as an example then. So there's examples of this justice.
You mean Ananias and Sapphira? Yeah. Well, of course, that was because they lied about what they got. It wasn't that they sold it and got something, or that they didn't give it all. It was because they lied and said, "Yeah, this is everything," and so trying to put themselves up as more. And so, again, we see these things, and I think we can kind of understand, some of them and relate to that. Davidson viewed himself as standing in a tradition defined by Harding. Okay, so that's how he viewed himself. I'm just doing what he said to do. But in reality, he and Benson and others in this period turned the teachings of Harding and Armstrong into, basically kind of moralistic advice along the lines of Poor Richard's Almanac or entrepreneurial principles, along the lines of Bruce Barton's book, The Man Nobody Knows. Now, this was a book that we have no idea, being here where we're at, what that was. But in 1925, this was a book that was very popular and many people read. And so it was a best-selling book promoting this approach to life, business, and religion. It was similar to what Davidson's was. look at these, look at the blessings. God has blessed me. God can bless you. You know, all we got to do is turn on and listen to the televangelists, right? And we hear some of that thinking and that message. But in many ways, Davidson and Benson reflected the cultural beliefs of America in which they matured. And so again, this idea that our culture influences all of us. And the first quarter of the 20th century, when many Americans reaped the harvest of the gospel of wealth and shared the conviction of Calvin Coolidge that the business of America is America, or a business of America's business. And so we have heard that before. Now, remember what's happening. We all know of the Great Depression. Well, what happened right before the Great Depression? It was called the Roaring Twenties, and it wasn't just because the guys were getting rich because they had prohibition. There was tremendous wealth. There was this economic rising. There was obviously the real rich folk, but a lot of people, not everybody. It isn't like it is now, but it was a time of this, and then of course it crashed. And so in that light, you've got to think, wow, we're doing something right to receive all this blessing. And blessing is viewed as what? Financial reward and success and comfort and so on and so forth. And we've all thought that way to some degree or another because we just naturally would. And so they're struggling with that too. Clinton Davis and George Benson clearly shared the conviction that when paired with Benson's strident affirmation of capitalism and opposition to communism, we can see how friendly heirs of the Stone Campbell tradition unwittingly went against their own religious heritage. So what does that mean? That's saying that Davidson, taught by Harding, Benson, taught by Armstrong, familiar with that, in tune to it, yet because of their experiences, they ended up drifting away from that and almost aiding the demise of that way of thinking, though they did not do it in a hostile way as some others were going to do. So just...
But you have to also take into consideration that Harding and Benson, or Davidson and Benson, had a tremendous responsibility and goal to save Harding University. It was on its last leg when Benson came in.
Sure.
So they utilized the success that was available. Davidson must have been a phenomenal person. We could put up with Benson and not give him everything. They laugh about people coming in Benson's office and him getting them to write checks they never thought they'd write, you know. Cliff Gaines used to say he was $1 a year man, and Benson talked him out of 50 cents of that. So, and I don't doubt that was true. I think they were so focused on their mission that they were willing to bend what they had been taught by their predecessors and what they had seen in their predecessors.
Yeah.
Going on the way it was going, Harding was headed for the scrap heap, and Benson knew his job was to save it.
Well, just like the other schools that we taught on, that Armstrong and all them kind of, yeah, it was a struggle. And so, you know, what did he do? Paid off the debt, and by the time he left, they had $25 million or so in their endowment. And so, you know, kind of exactly what you're talking about. But the point is that we're seeing lived out in these experiences, these things, this transition that's going on, whether it was benign or it was hostile, as we're now going to become aware of. And now we're going to look into Foy E. Wallace Jr. Have we heard that name? Did any of you ever hear him speak? Little before that, he died in '79. So you did? Okay. Now, to some degree, this battle launched by friendly troops against the Stone Lipscomb tradition made it unnecessary the battle that was going to be waged by the foes of premillennial thought. In other words, what Davidson and Benson were doing made this soft transition, if you will, away from the apocalyptic view of things. Well, there was others where, no, we're not going to do that. Nonetheless, those intent on purging churches of Christ of all premillennial settlements remained blissfully unaware that people like Benson and Davidson were at a basic level their allies rather than their enemies. In other words, they were bringing about the same result. One did it kind of in a soft, benign way, and another was going to be less than that. When Davidson and Benson refused to condemn R.H. Bull and R.N. Armstrong, okay, they were the champions of the premillennial thought. Hey, these are our friends. We're not going to go rip them and tear them apart like you are. Well, then all of a sudden they had their sights turned on them, some segments, and so they sought to get rid of that, because remember, for them, people like Wallace and others, they saw this premillennial view as just a terrible thing. It was at best you were naive, and at worst it was this evil kind of thing. And so their view is you got to get rid of that. The man who more than anyone else marshaled the attack against Armstrong, Bull, and Harding was Foye Wallace Jr. And he was a Texan who edited the Gospel Advocate from 1930 to 1934. And then in 1935, he left. And I can't remember if he was, fired or because they weren't tough enough for him or exactly what it was. But he went and formed his own publication called the Gospel Guardian. And, it's really interesting as you look, and if you look back on the history of some of the papers, you had in the 19th century, you had the heretic detector. In other words, there were those that were going to determine for everybody else what was right and what wasn't right. And so, here we see kind of in that tradition a little bit, we're guarding the gospel. We're keeping it right from all these influences that are going on. And this was made for the express purpose of purging this premillennial view from our fellowship. And in 1938, he then established another paper which lasted much longer called the Bible Banner. And that still may be around. I'm not positive, but that still may be around, in which he published stinging attacks on premillennialism, pacifism, and on the apocalyptic worldview. And so remember, in these journals, we see that was a form of communication of the going back and forth. So this person reads this in that journal, and so in this journal, they put on their opinion about what's being said over there, and back and forth. And sometimes they'll let somebody write a letter and they'll publish it in theirs. It's not for that position. They'll just go on and on and on. And if you've ever read any of these, you can see some of them can get pretty intense. Not real charitable, not real gracious, but very much in a fighting spirit. Wallace was another transformational figure in our history, especially on the side of our heritage that had taken what went on with the Christian Baptists. Remember what was happening when Campbell published the Christian Baptist. He was looking at this Christendom, and he's kind of pointing out all the things that he thinks is wrong with it and tearing it up, and that attracted a great segment. Now later, he softened that view, if you will, and became the millennial harbinger, where it wasn't to that degree later on. But that tradition tended to really stick with us. And we went over that in a great intensity. And so Wallace took that debating, hard-charging style, some would say, to a new level. And actually, that way of doing things was going to be very influential upon the reputation of a lot in the churches of Christ. The great debaters, this or that, and all these things. Well, a lot of that was earned with what we're going to look at here. He was the son of a well-known preacher, Foye Wallace Sr. Wallace gained fame among churches of Christ in early life as a boy wonder pulpiteer. In other words, as a young man, I don't know what he was, 12 or something, he would go around preaching. Carl Ketcherside was similar in that. He was a boy preacher and went around and gained a lot of fame and all that for that at a very young age, if you will. And so that's kind of interesting. As a skilled and intimidating speaker and debater, and especially as a fighting editor, he soon developed an enormous following, especially west of the Mississippi. In the 30s and 40s, he emerged as the single most influential preacher in the Churches of Christ. Now we're saying influential, with power to crush most who resisted his opinions and leadership. Because there's many that viewed, if you don't hold this position on this, and and that's how many looked at it, of whatever position you want to put up for looking at. Wallace brought nothing new to the attack on Bull and the premillennial eschatology, but he did turn the attack into a withering barrage. In other words, he wasn't bringing new thoughts to it, he was just really piling it on. By combining rational analysis with biting ridicule and sarcasm and name-calling, he charged the premillennialists were widely divisive. And by 1949, when he discontinued the Bible banner, I guess it's not around, premillennialism and the entire apocalyptic worldview was lost among churches of Christ, except for a group of congregations located around Louisville and New Orleans that remained loyal to the position. And that was, if you remember that publication, The Word and Work, that Bull went to become editor of, was based in Louisville and had been in New Orleans at one time. And so those were areas of influence. Wallace and his followers had convinced most members of the mainstream churches of Christ that premillennialists were at best badly deceived and at worst fundamentally evil. So they took this position, this way of looking at this thing, this way that had been very common among many, especially those in Tennessee, and now it's turned against that by this time. And so we see this evolution going on. The fact that Wallace was able to consolidate and direct so much inordinate power tells us something about the piety of our tradition. Now, piety is how your rules of government, if you will. How, we have elders and this and that and so on and so forth. That's our piety. Churches of Christ, we've often claimed that we possess no organizational structure over and beyond the local congregation. And of course, that's the main component in why we always said we're not a denomination, because we don't have this formal structure, so we can't be that. However, the truth is this absence of any formalized power allowed ambitious leaders to seize power they likely could not have claimed otherwise. In other words, personalities, as Carl Ketcherside would say, and also the publications. How many, maybe you heard it said, or maybe you said, why? Well, I follow the firm foundation. I follow the Gospel Advocate. And I'm not trying to say that like, well, how can you possibly do? I don't mean that. But in other words, those are the things that you read and kind of agree with. And so one's a follower of that. Whereas others would say, well, firm foundation, Gospel Advocate are way too liberal. I read the Bible banner. And so on and so forth. And so depending on where you were, you had your approved paper or publication that one tended to follow maybe more than others. And like, how can, it's kind of like growing up. Our household was a Globe Democrat family. And we're talking newspapers. And of course, when that went defunct, what do you have? You had the Post-Dispatch. And sort of, have you read what's in the Post-Dispatch editorial page? And things. Well, it was kind of like that. Now, obviously, that's dealing with politics, but nonetheless, same kind of feeling there. So the battle against Harding College, we've already noted that Aaron Armstrong's refusal in 1934 to side with other presidents of the Church of Christ colleges to condemn premillennial sentiment. Pressed by his critics, Armstrong a year later declared his rejection of certain tenets of dispensational premillennialism. Now remember, we said this apocalyptic view and what fundamentalism was, or what premillennialism, how it came under fundamentalism, there might have been overlap, but there wasn't necessarily all of a buy-in to where they went with it. And remember, we said, where did premillennialism go? Well, you know, we Hal Lindsey, late great Planet Earth, and all that kind of stuff we talked about. They weren't necessarily promoting that, though maybe some might have. And so a year later, Armstrong declared his rejection of certain tenets, but he did not disavow his basic fundamental orientation that the kingdoms of the world are going to be destroyed, and so we need to follow Christ. And this left open a door for his enemies to pursue his demise. And so the idea of if you hold to this, you must hold to all of that. And so it's either all or nothing, kind of like the environment we're in now that we see going on in our country. It's either you're all this or you're all that, and there's no in between. And so the man Wallace trusted most to clean up the mess at Harding College, that's how those things are viewed, and secure the ouster of Armstrong, because they viewed he's the problem, was a preacher at the 4th and State Street Church in Little Rock called E.R. Harper. And Harper moved to Little Rock in 1933, and for his first 5 or 6 years there, he supported Harding in a variety of ways, even while questioning its alleged premillennialism. He eventually became convinced that it is impossible to get the administration to take a definite stand for the old paths and renounce bullism. And so here's a guy that doesn't agree necessarily with things, but he has cordial relationships, if you will, in support of Harding. But by the influence of others, he's pulled away from that position. And so from that time on, Harper was an opponent of Harding. He maintained that Benson's great sin, so you're looking at the president, and again, we see this sinking, and I'm not saying right or wrongly, but we see that playing out with the stuff going on in the campuses now that you see on the news every night. And so you got calls for the presidents to step down and this and that. And I'm not trying to equate them as all equal or anything. I'm just saying that it's that similar kind of drama, if you will. Well, I'm not disputing that. I'm not disputing that. But again, just trying to get us to relate to contemporary things, to kind of get the emotional feel of what's happening in some areas. And so his problem was that he kept Armstrong as the chair of the Bible department after he stepped down from the presidency of Harding. And Harper had insisted that Armstrong was a rank premillennialist and should be fired. If Benson would take that step, Harper would be satisfied. And so Benson's getting a lot of heat. All personalities. Shocking, isn't it? Yes, Bill. Satan likes to stir it up. And so a lot of times we try to tell ourselves this is a big thing, and really James talks about those things at war within us. War within us. So see, the Bible does deal with these things. And yet often, what do? We dismiss that because we think that, that this is right. And I'm not saying it necessarily is or isn't, but I'm saying these are these things that we're warned about, these passions that can be within us. And we see it playing out. The extent of Foye Wallace's immense power among churches of Christ, even in the fight against Harding, became apparent when Harper struck an agreement with Benson in late 1939 to drop his fight against Harding if Benson would hire an assistant to Armstrong that was not premillennial. Okay, so he's trying to find a compromise to make it work. Well, when Wallace heard this, of course, he put Harper, here, you take care of this. Whoa, that isn't what I wanted. And so when Wallace learned of this, without any changes having been made, and with the same regime in control on such far-reaching action involving the destiny of the cause of Christ in a whole section of the country, he was enraged. And he's saying, what did that accomplish? And again, we see this playing out in the political battles that go on. And depending on what side we're on, in looking at things, we go, well, that didn't do anything. That's just window dressing. They're just trying to pull the wool over the eyes, so on and so forth. And so he wanted to get rid of the guy, and he's trying to work with him. And so he didn't take that well. Wallace, that's a view of the copy of the Bible banner. I cannot remember if that is a copy of one talking about this or not, but I just had a copy of it up there so you could see it. I understand that. I tried to blow it up and read it too to make sure this morning, but anyhow, but just wanted to see that these publications existed. Wallace concluded that the school must have the drop on Brother Harper, and brought him out with his hands up, and he intimated that he might no longer use someone who hits and runs in a significant way in the Bible banner. So what is Wallace? He's ripping Harper. He's ripping Harper, tearing him down.
You mentioned all these guys being in heaven together?
You would think their perspective would change, but nonetheless, and so we see this, and this happened a lot. I didn't say everybody. Doesn't remember we've learned in all this there's a big spectrum, but nonetheless, this was kind of characteristic. Apparently desperate to reclaim his standing with Wallace, Harper explained, "I never raised my hands because someone gets to drop on me." And he took the action he did because we had an opportunity to win the fight. He asked Wallace to view his proposed agreement with Benson as but a shifting of battlegrounds to carry on the fight. We're hoping to get inside the camp where the fighting would be at close range and the bullseye more easily hit. Specifically, he had in mind working our way into the Bible department. We thought that we had a way into the temple where we could render help in cleansing it of its money changers and bull sympathizers. So he's saying, hey, here's my master plan. I was trying to get somebody on the inside to kind of do the work. So he's defending his sinking to the attacks that are coming from Wallace, who put him in charge. Harding College responded with an official college bulletin. That was a that'd be something they would put out, and I tried to find these. And if I had access to all the microfilm and data, because you can, I didn't have that, and I was trying to find the bulletin that was saying this, but I couldn't because I didn't have access, in which officials expressed outrage at Harper's confession that his proposed agreement had been merely a trick to get inside the camp. And he condemned Harper's actions as sort of Nazi treachery. Well, why do you call it Nazi treachery? Because the Nazis were in Europe. This was in the 30s and the early 40s, okay? And so he's pulling a contemporary thing and comparing it to that. And we thought belonged only to an unscrupulous dictator who he feels himself above the moral law. In addition, the bulletin suggested that Harper's article reflects almost an abject submission before Brother Wallace. It seems ready to kiss the hand that lashed him so severely. And so we see this back and forth, and the criticisms going both ways, and the defensiveness, and so on. Well, such was the power of Wallace and the nature of this struggle that went on over this. And so we saw something that was once a very prominent view has been changing over time because of world events. The wars caused a rethinking on premillennial, outside pressures from the government and other things, our American patriotism, like how can you not support what these, and so on and so forth. And we see all these things coming up and have worked to kind of bring this about. And so we'll go ahead and we'll stop there. But again, not a pleasant thing. But these are things that happen. And so this kind of became a reputation back then. And so as we see this developing and changing, and so part of that is for us to look at and to see that, you know, we have a tendency to think the way we understand things is the way they've always been, and that isn't necessarily so. And so, and why is it important to understand this? To understand what happened later. And so that's why we're, you know, getting all the background. So thank you very much, and we are over, and let's have a great